are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran.
Because a nuclear Iran is a threat to our national...
We want to be friends with America. We want to be accepted as part of the family. The nuclear family.
Officials will continue their search for some way to negotiate the hostages' freedom.
To make that statement that he wants to wipe another country in its neighborhood off the map.
Strongest sanctions against Iran in history, and it is crippling their economy.
30 years, Iran has baffled and defeated Western leaders.
The responsibility is fully my own.
Power to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Everything in my power.
Here in my car, I feel safest of all. I can lock all my doors. It's the only way to live in cars.
Hello and welcome to this third and final instalment of the IRUS podcast series, coming to you from Southampton University. In the last two episodes, we looked at the events surrounding the 1979 US embassy hostage crisis in Tehran, followed by a look at its causes and the extent of the role played by the 1953 coup. Today we will be looking at the aftermath of the crisis, its long-term economic and domestic consequences, and the state of Iran-US relations in the world today. Hi, I'm James and I'm joined by Will.
Hi there.
And of course by our recurring guest and dear friend, Ignorant Jon.
Let's do this. Yeah, so first off, I think it's important to say that the crisis has had a huge impact on the world today, and...
Whoa, hold on a second. I'm not so sure about that. The crisis happened over 30 years ago. The hostages themselves were released, Khomeini got to keep his rule of Iran, everybody wins. Tensions are nowhere near as bad as they were back in 79.
Okay, that's a pretty sweeping opening statement from Ignorant Jon there. I think we need to answer this carefully.
Agreed. John, I'm afraid it's not as simple as all that. Tensions may have relaxed slightly since the crisis, but they're still pretty bad.
Oh yeah? So things may still be bad between Iran and the US, but surely Iran did well out of this. They're being left alone now, isn't that what they wanted? They got to keep Khomeini.
Well, firstly, they're hardly being left alone, and Khomeini came at a price for a lot of people. Khomeini had a radical impact on the political and social landscape in Iran.
Indeed, the crisis can be seen as one way in which Khomeini attempted to remove the moderates from Iranian politics, such as with people like Bazar Khan. In 1988, around 2,800 prisoners were executed, leading to many resignations in protest, as well as severing ties with most leftist groups. This purging of possible opposition and the polarizing of the party was perhaps Khomeini's way of reassuring himself that Iran would not revert to a liberal or even Western mindset after he had gone.
Oh wow, that's intense. Was the crisis used in other ways to influence internal Iranian affairs?
Well, the rallying of the people behind the hostage takers was a real indication that, by creating a common enemy, some pretty provocative policies could be introduced. The war with Iraq, as well as the introduction of reformist policies, like the redistribution of land from millionaires to the peasantry, allowed Khomeini's regime to basically begin a war on Western culture. They created something called the Ministry of Islamic Guidance to enforce this. From the ministry came the lowering of the age of marital consent from girls to 13, the removal of women from the judiciary and education, the alienating of other religious groups, and the introduction of the Islamic Code of Appearance, discouraging the wearing of ties for men and making the wearing of scarves, long coats, and the chador mandatory for women.
So culture became pretty conservative and religious then?
Perhaps in a social sense, yes. But politically, the regime became what might be wrongly described as more Western.
Wait, why wrongly?
Well, buddy, with the new republic came Iran's own form of democracy, one which could be compared to Western systems. But it is essentially unique in its combination of the modern form of government with the Majlis, their equivalent, the Houses of Parliament, and also the supervision of the Guardian Council, effectively ensuring that religious concerns are not removed from politics. It's a form of theocracy, really.
So this Islamic revolution was more of a transition to the new regime rather than the 1789 French Revolution-style bloodbath.
It wasn't as drastic as that, but it had its share of blood. Between 1981 and 1985, around 8,000 people were executed by the revolutionary courts, not to mention those who died in the Iran-Iraq War. The period after Khomeini's death in 1989 is also referred to as a thermidor. reminiscent of the Western history, yet there was no great purge of the radicals, but rather a move towards reformism in the 90s.
Oh yeah? What kind of reforms?
Well, in the 90s, President Rafsanjani introduced economic reforms in order to free up the market and allowed more imported consumer goods into society, along with basic utilities, such as electricity and piped water.
At a macroeconomic level, the liberal policies advocated by Rafsanjani were continued by Khatami, and followed the previous government's commitment to modernisation and industrialisation set out in the first 5-year economic development plan. Khatami claims economic development, a stimulated private sector, and 6% economic growth as positive outcomes of the policy. Khatami has also acknowledged Iran's economic challenges, claiming there was a vital need for fundamental restructuring. His attempt to push through such reforms has angered hardliners who disapprove of the reform, so his most recent activity is to support the moderate Rouhani in the 2013 presidential elections, rather than actively pursue it himself.
Ah, so the country had come a long way since the revolution and the war.
Yep. Over the past 100 years, the Iranian people had seen a lot of difficulties, wars and dictators, etc. So, by the end of millennium, there was a greater sense of national identity, which is shown in the way politics moved away from the clerics to a certain extent, and towards a less religiously focused view on politics and Iranian citizenship.
So just like today, then?
Well, to a certain extent, Ignorant Jon. But there was a revival of conservative opinion after the reformers were undermined by the use of veto by the Guardian Council, and also the Axis of Evil speech.
Axis of Evil? Sounds pretty menacing.
It was a speech given by George Bush Jr. back in 2002, implicating Iran as a threat to the United States.
So, what's that got to do with today's situation, then?
That's the long and short of it. President Ahmadinejad was elected, and a focus was put on the development of nuclear power, both within the politicians and the Guardian Council. Looking at the 2013 Iranian elections, many of the stronger candidates had backgrounds in the country's nuclear program, so there was a real need for the government to have a leader with experience in nuclear politics.
I've got to say, guys, all of these consequences seem pretty much internal, like all to do with Iran and not outside the country. Seems to me things weren't that bad following the hostage crisis, at least not between Iran and the United States.
Unfortunately, not by a long shot. There were a load of consequences of the crisis, economically, socially, politically, both short and long term. It's almost strange even using the phrase long-term consequences, because many of the issues the crisis caused still haven't been resolved.
So Iran is still a hot topic in Western politics, then?
Yeah, it's as controversial as ever. President Obama vowed only this year to do everything in his power to prevent Iran developing nuclear weapons, and he hasn't ruled out military intervention. As of the International Atomic Energy Agency's 2013 report, the program is still developing.
Well, okay, let's try and break it down. What have America's strategies towards Iran been since the crisis?
Well, most of them are economic. Trade sanctions are the main strategy. They've used it as a way to force Iran into diplomacy in the past, and to try and limit its capacity to produce nuclear arms. Mostly, they involve the banning of trade of any Iranian produce, particularly things like petroleum, so limiting its exports, and banning the trade of a lot of Western produce into Iran, to try and keep it a few steps behind technologically, and to use their superior equipment as a bargaining chip if they ever needed one.
What are the effects of these sanctions, then?
Well, they vary. Economically, it's very tough on Iran. They lose about $61 billion a year because of the sanctions. And the oil and gas sanctions cut its exports down by anything from 25 to 50%. Iran is a very oil-dependent economy, and the sanctions deny it some of its biggest customers.
Have they been strict with these sanctions?
Yeah, on the whole. But you do get examples like in 1986, where the Reagan administration wasn't above selling weapons to Iran to fund the Contras.
Oh, I see. So the sanctions are merely economic. They weaken the government of Iran and not the people of Iran.
Well, on paper, yes, but sadly that's not always the case. A lot of people have been harmed by the sanctions. For example, there was a sanction on the trade of US aircraft repair parts to Iran. Now, that was a pretty standard sanction, but the de facto side effect of it was that the Iranian civilian aircraft became dangerously outdated. In the last 25 years, there have been 17 plane crashes, which have killed 1,500 people.
But that's terrible. Surely something's being done to avoid that sort of thing happening. Aren't they changing the sanctions?
Yeah, it's probably true that neither side wants to see innocent lives lost. So, in 2005, there were talks geared towards lifting the sanctions of repair parts to prevent any more needless death. But overall, as time goes by, most of the talk on Iran's sanctions is about making them harsher. It's probably going to get better before it gets worse. Plus, the perpetuation of Iran-US tension can lead to some horrible things, like Iran Air Flight 665.
Wait, what was that?
And that was a terrible accident that happened back in 1988. There was a communication breakdown between a commercial Airbus and an American naval destroyer that led the US Navy to mistake it for an attacking aircraft. It was shot down with a guided missile and killed the 290 civilians on board. All different nationalities, 66 of them were children. It was a tragedy. One of the consequences of the hostage crisis was a general distrust of one another as nations. When tensions are running as high as that, accidents happen, and they can often be catastrophic.
Wow. So that's what led to the situation being the way it is today then?
Yeah, that's basically it.
Guys, I think I really get it now. So 1953 was not really the cause of the hostage crisis, and it wasn't strictly a CIA-led mission. I've learned all about the course of the event, and you guys have shown me that the consequences have been far-reaching and are still seen today. There's been times when it comes to this whole topic that I've been certain that it was Iran's fault and then it was America's fault, but I guess this whole event is not a black and white issue. Guys, I'm feeling different. I'm feeling smart.
Hey, that's really great, Ignorant Jon. I'm proud of you, mate.
Yeah, well done, Ignorant Jon.
Yeah, guys, I was going to actually say, maybe you could stop calling me Ignorant Jon. Maybe I could just be, John.
Oh, Ignorant Jon.
No, guys, seriously, I think...
And that's all we've got time for. We hope you've enjoyed this IRUS series of podcasts on Iran-US relations. So, to wrap up, finally, it's goodbye from me. Goodbye. It's goodbye from Will.
Goodbye.
And it's the last goodbye from our colleague and good friend, Informed Jon.
Oh, you guys.
Here in my car, I know I've started to think about leaving tonight, although nothing seems right in cars.
There's a gentleman at the bar who wants to know if you'd marry him.
No.
Body language by Playtex. Wear it, and you may have to say no more often.
In cars.